Howdy, it's Kyle talking about rural America and why so much of it is struggling economically right now. More than half of the rural counties in the US are currently losing population, and this is nothing new. This has been going on for quite a while, and most of the population decline has been due to economics. For a region to survive, it has to have an economy based on something. So whether you're the financial capital of the world or the aerospace capital of the world or the hot dog stand capital of the world, your economy has to be based on something. So in this video, I'm going to discuss 15 major sectors of the economy and why that might lead to rural America struggling so much because so many of these can't be done in small areas. For the various economic sectors, I'm not going to be doing them in any specific order, but generally starting with the ones where you need to be more in a large population center and then ending with the ones that are more feasible at the rural level. I'm going to start with the high-tech sector, and that can be all sorts of things, including software development, video game design, AI development, driverless car technologies. And for the most part, these are located in big cities. They don't need to be in the largest cities, but normally they want to be located in places where there's a big talent pool of people that know a lot of this high-tech stuff. But from a rural perspective, you're not going to have a huge number of jobs in this sector. You might have a handful of people that live in some small town that are working remotely in high tech, but you're not going to have a large pool of people, so you're not going to have a large high tech sector in a rural area. The next sector I want to talk about is the medical field. And this can be anything from a large medical clinic, such as the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, or the Sansum Clinic in Santa Barbara, California, or it can be the huge clinics in the big cities in Houston and Cleveland. But in general, these are going to be located in larger cities, and in the case of the Mayo and Sansum clinics, these are some of the world's elite doctors. They want to live in some of the nicest towns, and for Minnesota and California, that could be Rochester and Santa Barbara. But you're not going to have a huge clinic, a huge medical presence in a small town. There just isn't a large enough population there. But the medical field isn't just a clinical side. It can also be research, biosciences, biophysics. These types of things are very big in the economy for the Raleigh-Durham area in North Carolina, referred to as the Research Triangle, also in Columbus, Ohio, and the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And for this sector of the biosciences, you really need to be in a larger city because not that many people know this kind of stuff and are qualified for it. So you have to be in a big city where you can even find a few hundred that can do this. But the medical field also includes manufacturing, including the making of high-tech medical stuff such as pacemakers. And once again, the Twin Cities have a huge presence in this field. But medical manufacturing is a good segue into the next sector of the economy I'm going to discuss, just general manufacturing. You have heavy and light manufacturing, heavy being automobiles, trucks, appliances. But we often forget about light manufacturing, things such as toasters and blenders, backpacks, kayaks, and motorcycle helmets. But whether it be light or heavy manufacturing, you need a large number of jobs there. So say this factory has 1,000 jobs. Well, if there are 1,000 employees, some of these are going to be married, some are going to be single, some will have kids, some won't. So 1,000 jobs might be at least 3,000 people or so. Well, 3,000 people need services. There's probably going to have to be a school there, maybe a clinic, some stores, a couple of diners, whatnot. All of a sudden you have 10,000 people there. Well, if it's 10,000, then you got to have a secondary school, and then you got to have all other things, and before you know it, you have a town of maybe 20,000 or so. And I'm not sure about the actual formula for this, but if you have, say, a 5,000 job factory, you're going to have maybe 50,000 people in the town to just make that all work out. So you're not going to have a big factory in a small town. So you can't have an automotive assembly plant with 3,000 jobs in a town with 2,000 people. It's just not going to work. So big manufacturing, again, whether it be things that are large like cars and appliances or smaller things that are still a lot of people like toasters and blenders, you need to be in a larger city for that. The next sector I'm going to discuss is the finance sector. This can include banking, insurance, real estate, stock market, credit cards, and these are often your big skyscrapers in the big cities. And like the high-tech sector, many of these jobs can be done remotely. I'm sure there are plenty of stockbrokers working from the middle of nowhere, but most of these types of jobs are going to be in bigger cities. Another aspect of the economy is shipping. But obviously with shipping, you have to be along a coast or one of the Great Lakes, and there are a limited number of deep water ports in the country, and most of these are going to be big cities. That's why these cities were founded in the first place. There are a couple of small towns where shipping is a big part of the economy, including one in Idaho of all places. But for the most part, shipping needs to be in a bigger city. Okay, the next sector I'm going to discuss is military. And almost by default, any place that has a decent sized military base is not going to be super rural. So all bases have at least 1,000, if not several thousand enlisted. And many of them are going to be married. Some are single, some have kids, some don't. But you also have a town that builds up around this base. I looked around the U.S., and I don't think there's any small town in the U.S. that has a big base. You have small-ish towns such as Dothan, Ohio, and Lemoore, California, where my dad was stationed in the Navy, but you don't have any really small towns with a base, again, because just by having a base, you're going to be a little bit bigger by default. And the military sector can also extend into aerospace and military contracting and NASA stuff, but that's also going to be in larger population centers. We have a larger number of people. You can have a pool of people that can do these high-tech skills. But military is a good segue into the next sector of the economy, and that's government. So you think specifically about Washington, D.C. or state capitals, and for the most part, they have to be in bigger towns. If you have a state with millions of people, you're going to have at least tens of thousands of government workers. By default, it's going to be a decent-sized town. But here is one sector where there are a couple of really small towns that are state capitals that are pretty nice. I'm thinking specifically of Pierre, South Dakota and Montpelier, Vermont. These are both nice little towns. But there are only 50 state capitals and only a few of them are small towns. Most of the rest are in bigger cities. And government is a nice segue into the next sector I'll discuss, and that is universities. A small town can have a decent sized college and have a nice economy there and be a pretty nice place. Some of these might be public universities. Think of a place like Pullman, Washington, in the middle of absolute nowhere, but it is a pretty nice town. Places like Amherst, Massachusetts, Oxford, Mississippi, and yes, Clemson, South Carolina are pretty nice small towns with a big university. And unlike a manufacturing plant where you have, say, 5,000 jobs and you need 50,000 people in a town to support that, for a university you could have 10,000 students and maybe still only have 15,000 in that town. Most are students, with most not having kids. Professors are less likely to have large families than most other types of professions. Students have less money, there's less places to spend money on, fewer stores. But it doesn't have to be just public universities, it can also be private university towns such as Ithaca, New York, or Hanover, New Hampshire. But just like state capitals, there is a limited number of small towns that can have a decent-sized university. So now I want to discuss some of the sectors of the economy that are feasible in rural areas. The first few I'll discuss are dependent on very specific geography, and the first will be fishing and seafood. Obviously here you have to be coastal or perhaps along a great lake, but most of the areas along the coasts are heavily populated. And other than Alaska, there are only a handful of small towns in the US where fishing is the main part of the economy. There are a couple in Washington, a couple in Maine, a couple in Louisiana, but for the most part, large-scale commercial fishing is based in larger towns. The next sector I'll discuss is mining. And this can be for precious metals, iron ore, lithium, or all sorts of things. But just like seafood, you have to have a very specific geography. You can't just have copper mining anywhere. But in general, places that have copper or iron ore mining as a big part of its economy tend to be a little bit wealthier than some of the other rural areas. And you look at places in Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Minnesota where mining is a big part of the economy, and some of these small towns are generally a little bit nicer than some of the ones that don't have the mining sector. But I'll say it again, limited places where you can have mining, so you can't just say, hey, West Virginia, you're really poor, why don't you turn some of those coal mines into copper mines? But that takes me as a nice segue into the next aspect of mining, and that's coal mining. But unlike precious metal or iron ore mining, the places that have coal mining as its main part of the economy haven't really benefited financially. And in fact, it may have the opposite effect. Take a look at this map of West Virginia. The counties that have the most coal mining are the poorest counties in the entire state, which makes these some of the poorest areas in the entire developed world. I'm not sure the reasoning for this, but many other types of mining, the money seems to trickle down to the workers and the local area, but for coal mining, not so much. Okay, the next sector I want to discuss is forestry. And yeah, let me push repeat on this one. There are a limited number of places where you can have forestry as a feasible part of the economy. These are largely going to be located in the Pacific Northwest, some of the upper Midwest, and parts of the Southeast. So you think even during the times when forestry was a much larger industry, there were only a handful of small towns in the entire country where this was a big part of the economy. So fishing, mining, and forestry combined, there really aren't a huge number of small towns that can benefit from this. Next, I want to discuss the energy sector, primarily oil and natural gas. And even though you certainly need a specific type of geography for this type of extraction, the areas that have large oil and natural gas deposits tend to be large regions as opposed to just a smaller area where it's feasible for mining. And as a result, you can have an entire region's economy, if not an entire state's economy, based on oil or natural gas. And because of how widespread the energy reserves are, it's a big part of the economy for big cities like Dallas and Oklahoma City, and smaller towns like Odessa, Midland, or even tiny little towns like Mentone. It's also had a big effect on western North Dakota, specifically in Williston and Watford City. And what you see in many of these rural areas are relatively high wages, but the towns can look kind of rough. Much of these small oil towns have a very male-dominated population. A lot of guys 20 to 40-year-old who are single, kind of roughneck, and often don't care about how things look. Some of these towns do look pretty rough, but again, the wages are relatively high. The next sector I want to discuss is tourism. There is a fair number of small towns in the U.S. dependent on tourism, and I've mentioned a few of them in previous videos, including Galena, Illinois, Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, Bahaba, Maine, Bisbee, Arizona. So these are small towns where tourism is the main part of the economy, and these are generally nicer towns than some of these other towns that are not tourism dependent. But it's kind of a chicken and egg thing with these towns. Are they nice because tourists go there and keep the economy flowing, or do tourists go there because they are already nice? But it's worth pointing out that many small towns wouldn't want a lot of visitors, even if they were able to draw them in. And the last sector I'll mention is the very first one that most people think of when they're discussing the economy of rural areas, and that's agriculture. Agriculture itself involves several subsectors, including crops, grains, seed oils, dairy, and livestock. And just about everywhere in the contiguous U.S. can have some type of agriculture, one of these subsectors. With regard to crops, I grew up in the crop growing capital of the U.S., and I can say with certainty that the really small towns, these rural areas in the farming community, are some of the poorest towns in the U.S. And I think that's largely because with respect to crops, when we go to the grocery store, we expect to pay next to nothing for them. Farmers have to really cut costs to make produce available at the prices we're willing to pay. But the San Joaquin Valley, where I grew up, is also the dairy capital of the U.S., but most of the dairies are just barely outside of the cities, so you need to be kind of in or right near a bigger city for the dairy economy. And with dairy, because of refrigeration, you want to be as close to the big airports and big truck transit centers as possible. So you normally don't find dairies in the middle of absolute nowhere. With regard to livestock, there are plenty of people that have made millions of dollars off of this, but it's usually a small number of people making big money. For example, you might have a family that owns a huge 10,000 acre ranch or something, so they're making big money, but it is only a family of, say, 15 people. And sure, they have ranch hands and other employees, but there isn't usually a huge number of people involved with ranching. And you can see that in some of these really small towns in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, where livestock is a big deal, but many of these towns, the populations are measured in the hundreds. There are counties in western Nebraska that have 400, 500 people. You compare that to grains and soybeans, and the towns where that is a big part of the economy tend to be a little bit larger. You don't have some of these towns of a few hundred people in Iowa that's driving a big part of the grain and soybean economy. And there are plenty of small towns in the Midwest that are focused on soybeans and or corn, grains, or whatever, and these towns for the most part are nicer than similar sized towns in the Southeast. And just like California, most of the agriculture in the Southeast is crop-based, so low operating cost, low wages. So hey, Southerners and Californians, you can agree on this. Your small farm towns are really poor. And even though agriculture is the sector of the economy that should be the most reliable for rural areas, some of the parts of the country that are heavily dependent on agriculture, including places where it's really big, are still really poor. So when I look down this list of sectors of the economy, I see that high-tech, medical, manufacturing, finance, military, and shipping all need to be in a large population center. Government being a college town and tourism can lead to a smaller town having a stronger economy, but there are a limited number of places that can do this. Mining for metals can be lucrative, mining for coal not so much, but again, limited spots where you can do lucrative mining. And then you get to oil and natural gas, which is the sector of the economy that can have the largest positive effect on a rural area over a large region. But you do have to have those resources there in the first place, but they are more spread out than, say, precious metals. So with most of the major sectors of the economy of the U.S. being located in major cities, and you have a lot of the sectors of the economy that are in rural areas not giving a whole lot of money back to the local regions, you can see why rural America is struggling financially compared to the cities and suburbs. And with high levels of poverty, you have less health insurance, less likely to have nice clinics in that town, much more of a healthcare desert. Many rural areas, many small towns in the U.S. have been significantly hurt by the opioid crisis. And unfortunately, more and more of rural America is falling into that category. It's not getting better, it's getting worse for the most part. So that was my look at the major sectors of the economy and how that might lead to rural America struggling. And the point of this video wasn't to come up with the solutions on how to improve this, but just to highlight what some of the problems are and some of the struggles they're going to face, and then let some of the really smart people of the world determine what might be the best way to move forward to improve the financial situation in some of these rural parts of the country. But if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerd. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. As always, thank you very much.